Well, we are continuing with the series that we've been doing that takes a look at our basic unity teachings, what we call our 5 basic principles. We started last week talking about our first principle, which says that God is the one presence and power. We talked about how that principle, when we practice it, can be an antidote to a lot of fear and suffering in our lives and, of course, in the world. So our first principle says this: God is absolute good, everywhere present. If that's true, absolute good and everywhere present, then what does that say about each one of us? It says something really important, because what this principle tells us is about how God shows up in the world, and it starts with each one of us. So our second principle says this: human beings have a spark of divinity within them, the Christ Spirit within. Their very essence is of God, and therefore they are also inherently good. Now some folks hear that, and they say, what? Is that all I get? A spark? That's it? Karen and I had an instructor when we were at Unity Institute, and she felt that way about it, and I understand what they're saying. You know, these aren't written in stone. Go to different Unity websites, you'll find this principle written a little bit differently in different places. But I think the spark metaphor works really well. You know, we live in fire country here, right? We know what one little spark can do and how powerful it can be. All we need is that spark. It means that we come into the world with everything that we need to literally create heaven on earth. But we have to know that the spark is there, and we have to nurture it. We have to take care of it. The illustration I like to use is watching someone start a fire, just using a flint and a piece of steel, striking a spark. You get a dried up hunk of bark like that and get that little spark going, and then you've got to be careful. You've got to nurture it. You've got to blow on it and gradually start adding more fuel to it until you get to this. And then from there, it's not too long before it gets to this. That spark can become a bonfire if you pay attention to it and nurture it and take care of it. Our human evolutionary potential is like that spark, and our individual mission is to fan that spark into a flame. Everyone has the spark, and the spark can't go out, but it's up to us where it's going to go from there. It can stay a spark, or it can be fanned into a flame. We get to choose. We can ignore it, but it's always there trying to get our attention. This principle, just like our first principle, is clear and uncompromising, because we have to ask ourselves the question, just exactly which people, which human beings have this spark of divinity? According to this principle, it's everyone. We don't get to pick and choose, and that can cause some difficulties when we have to deal with people in the world who have caused a lot of pain and misery. Anyone can behold the Christ in someone like the Dalai Lama. That's pretty easy. But, you know, take a terrorist or a serial killer, and it becomes a lot more challenging. And a lot of times we look out there and we say, well, why should I have to behold the Christ in them? They certainly don't behold it in other people the way they treat people. You know, that's not the way it works. It's not about reciprocity. It's unconditional, which means that we have to start learning how to let go of a lot of our knee-jerk reactions to the things that we see in the world and the things that we encounter in other people. We have to do the inner work in order to recognize that spark of divinity in others, and it's important. This idea of human beings being inherently good is totally different from the message that we've been getting from various, call them old-time religions. You know, there are a lot of traditional Protestant congregations that are still following the teachings of a guy from the 16th century by the name of John Calvin, who liked to stress the fact, in his opinion, that human beings were most definitely not divine, but are totally depraved and worthless. This is a pleasant little quote from John Calvin that I've shared with you before, and it bears repeating. Calvin said, if God had formed us of the stuff of the sun or the stars, or if he had created any other celestial matter out of which man could have been made, then we might have said that our beginning was honorable. But we are all made of mud. And this mud is not just on the hem of our gown, or on the sole of our boots, or in our shoes. We are full of it. We are nothing but mud and filth, both inside and outside. And people wonder why the attendance at traditional Protestant congregations is declining. Huh? Surprise, surprise. Might have something to do with Mr. Calvin. And he was just following the lead of St. Augustine. St. Augustine is the one that gave us original sin, basically saying that we're so bad we even come into the world corrupt and sinful. So where exactly did this idea of human goodness and divinity come from then? Was this something that Unity sort of made up and invented? Well, if you pick up just about any book that was written by our Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore, you'll find a little paragraph on one of the opening pages which says this: Unity is a link in the great educational movement inaugurated by Jesus Christ. Our objective is to discern the truth and prove it. The truth that we teach is not new. Neither do we claim special revelations or discovery of new religious principles. Our purpose is to help and teach mankind to use and prove the eternal truth taught by the Master. So he's saying it's nothing new. We're not making this stuff up. We're not claiming to have discovered something brand new. And if that's the case, then we should be able to go back and take a look at the Christian scriptures, the Gospels, and some of the letters of Paul to find this idea of human divinity, or this idea of the Christ within. And in the handout in your bulletins, I've given you a good solid 10 passages that illustrate this idea coming from the Gospels and Paul's letters that talk about the Christ within. But let me just use two to help illustrate the point here. This is a familiar passage from the Gospel of Matthew. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And then Jesus responded, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. That's the Christ within. That's about as clear as it gets. Of course, we can always go to one of Paul's letters, Colossians. And by the way, Paul's letters are much older than any of the four Gospels. So if you want to get a handle on what that early experience was that the people were having of the life and teachings of Jesus, Paul's letters are sometimes a good place to go. In this passage he says, to them God chose to make known how great among the Gentiles are the riches of the glory of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. This is nothing new. This goes back to the very earliest days. From day one, the people who were closest to Jesus were talking about this idea of the Christ within, of God being present in and around us, ordinary mortals, with all of our flaws and imperfections. People really got it. They understood that Jesus was trying to tell people that they weren't worthless sinners. The message is you're not a worthless sinner. The message is that you're a magnificent, beloved expression of God. That's what Jesus came to teach and to exemplify by his life, that we are magnificent, beloved expressions of God. And somehow that got lost. Something went wrong. Something really went wrong. We have a minister we knew back in Kansas City. His name is Paul Smith, and he used to be the pastor of Broadway Baptist Church there in Kansas City. And he joined the ever-increasing ranks of people that are leaving behind that kind of religion. He bowed out of the Southern Baptist Convention and went his own way, and now he is a contributor and an author writing on Ken Wilber's Integral Christianity program online. And so here's a quote from Paul Smith that I really like. He says, Christianity began in Palestine as an experience. It moved to Greece and became a philosophy. It moved to Italy and became an institution. It moved to Europe and became a culture, and it moved to America and became a business. We've left the experience long behind. That's what happened. Calvin and Augustin missed out on the experience. To them, people weren't divine. They were depraved. Here we see from the earliest times that Jesus is telling people that they're worthy, and these two guys are trying to say, no, you're worthless. And it's that kind of thinking that leads to a very slippery slope. Seeing human beings as being essentially worthless makes it real easy to marginalize individuals and groups of people. You know, that's the same kind of attitude that's responsible for so much of the war and genocide that we see in the world. We woke up this morning to the news that Israel and Palestine are at it again in a big way, you know. This is important stuff. We need to start shifting consciousness, which is why this second principle is so important, because it really is a matter of life and death. It's essential to our survival as a species in the universe that we start to learn how to look at every individual human being and see them as the beloved expressions of God that they're meant to be in the world. There's a story, I think, that illustrates the importance of this and what can happen. It's a story called The Rabbis Gift. And this is a story about a great monastic order, a decaying monastery that had only 5 monks left in it. The order was dying. And in the surrounding deep woods, there was a little hut that a rabbi from a nearby town would use from time to time. The monks always knew the rabbi was home when they saw the smoke from his fire rise above the treetops. As the abbot agonized over the imminent death of his order, it occurred to him to ask the rabbi if he could offer any advice that might save the monastery. The rabbi welcomed the abbot into his hut, and when the abbot explained the reason for his visit, the rabbi could only commiserate with him. "I know how it is," he exclaimed. "The spirit has gone out of the people. It's the same in my town. Almost no one comes to the synagogue anymore." So the abbot and the rabbi sat together discussing the Bible and their faiths. The time came when the abbot had to leave. "It's been a wonderful visit," said the abbot, "but I failed in my purpose. Is there nothing you can tell me to help save my dying order?" "The only thing I can tell you," said the rabbi, "is that the Messiah is among you." When the abbot returned to the monastery, his fellow monks gathered around him and asked, "What did the rabbi say?" "He couldn't help," the abbot answered. "The only thing he did say as I was leaving was that the Messiah is among us, though I don't know what those words mean." So in the months that followed, the monks pondered this and wondered whether there was any possible significance to the rabbi's words. The Messiah is among us? Could he possibly have meant that the Messiah is one of the monks in this monastery? If that's the case, which one of us is the Messiah? Do you suppose he meant the abbot? Yes, of course. If he meant anyone, he probably meant Father Abbot. Certainly, he could not have meant Brother Eldred. Eldred gets crotchety and mean at times. But come to think of it, Eldred is right about a lot of things. Maybe the rabbi did mean Brother Eldred. Of course, the rabbi didn't mean me. He couldn't possibly have meant me. I'm just an ordinary person. Yet supposing he did, suppose I am the Messiah. As they contemplated in this manner, the monks began to treat each other with extraordinary respect, on the off chance that one among them might be the Messiah. And in turn, each monk began to treat himself with extraordinary respect. It so happened that people still occasionally came to visit the beautiful forest and the monastery. And without even being conscious of it, visitors began to sense a powerful spiritual aura. They were sensing the extraordinary respect that now filled the monastery. Hardly knowing why, people began to come to the monastery frequently to picnic, to play, and to pray. They began to bring their friends, and their friends brought their friends. And then it happened that some of the younger men who came to visit started to talk more and more with the older monks. After a while, one asked if he could join them. Then another and another joined the order. Within a few years, the monastery once again became a thriving order, a vibrant center of light and spirituality in the realm. So there it is. That's an example of what might happen if we started living from the consciousness that everyone really has that spark of divinity that can be fanned to a flame. And it can be challenging because there's a lot of folks who are really good at hiding it. Even so, it's still there. We're not just shifting consciousness. I mean, that's where it starts, but we're doing more than that. We're shifting our entire culture as long as we remember to practice the principles. You know, we can't expect people to want to give their best until we're willing to acknowledge the best in them. That's how it works. And it all leads into our third principle, which says that we are literally creating our experience of reality by the way we think. So, if we consistently hold thoughts of human depravity, what are we going to see and experience in the world and in our lives? On the other hand, if we can consistently hold thoughts of our essential dignity and goodness and the essential dignity and goodness of each person around us, well, imagine what can happen. More on that next week. Hope to see you then.